On the 27th of March, 2019, Mamu Eugenia Nothemba Gqowa, after battling with cancer for almost half of her life, took her last breath and transcended peacefully to her ancestors. It is against this backdrop that we are holding this important event a day before we remember her passing on. Distinguished guests, moderator, and panelists, on behalf of the board of the Eugenia Nothemba Gqowa Foundation, I wish to welcome you all to this important event. Good afternoon. I am Nomkita Geisman, the chair of the board. The foundation is a national women's rights organization headquartered in Makanda, also known as Grahamstown, with a satellite office in Cape Town, hosting us today, and another one in Johannesburg. The core business of the foundation is to contribute to efforts seeking to eliminate gender-based violence in South Africa. As we all know, GBV is a broad issue. Therefore, the foundation decided to carve its strategic niche to make a demonstrable contribution. This is communicated by the 4 programs it prioritized. However, due to time constraints,
Chair, can I perhaps ask you, sorry to interject.
Yes. Hello.
May I ask you perhaps to consider switching off your video because you keep breaking.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, it sounds like it's going to be much better now.
Okay. But it is worth mentioning that as the foundation, one of the programs is the one that is hosting us today called Knowledge Production and Application. Since its inception about 10 months ago, under this program, we've been working on a project focusing on underage forced child marriages, doing a desktop research, until now that we felt we should talk with professionals, experts, colleagues from like-minded organizations about the issue of child marriages. Fellow board members, distinguished guests, moderator and panelists, guided by the International Women's Day theme, Choose to Challenge, as the foundation, we're bringing this important question to ponder this afternoon. Can child forced underage marriages be classified as a form of GBV? A panel of experts led by a talented moderator will share with us. However, we expect the same from every one of us, but we will make our inputs through our chat box. Therefore, we kindly request every one of us to switch on off her mic and camera. Let's switch them off, sorry. You are requested to do the same with your details if you are comfortable to share with us, as we might need for future engagements around the subject matter. Fellow board members, distinguished guests, panelists, she grew up here, went to school here, only left Grahamstown, Makanda on acquiring her joint honors degree on journalism and media studies and industrial sociology from Rhodes. She went on to work in Joburg, where she furthered her studies and acquired a postgrad diploma in business administration. As if that was not enough, that was followed by acquiring a master's degree in business administration, both from one of the prestigious South African business schools, GBV. We are talking here about a result-driven corporate reputation management executive with a distinguished career in public affairs, government relations, corporate governance, corporate social investment, public policy, and editorial management. She has a progressive career underpinned by collaborating effectively with top corporate executives and stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about the head of SAP or APSA Group Stakeholder Relations Unit. Fellow board members, distinguished guests, panelists, join me to welcome our moderator of the event, Ms. Nonjatyambo, popularly known as Njaji Petros. Over to you, Njaji.
Thank you so much, Chair. I hope Dr. Roo has been able to get an idea of how to pronounce my name, which I know is a tongue twister for many people. But just very briefly, it is Njaji. In Xhosa, my full name means flower. I'm delighted to join you today and very honored to be directing this program. Let me say good afternoon to our esteemed panelists, the audience, and our support staff. I think we are all in this meeting today because we share a common concern about the scourge of gender-based violence. This is something that does not only hurt those who are subjected to it, but it destroys families and by extension, the very fiber of our society. We are honored to have a panel of experts who will help to broaden our understanding of gender-based violence and highlight the issue of child, forced, and underage marriages with a view to contribute towards finding sustainable solutions to this problem. So my role as a moderator is to help guide the conversation on this matter. We have an hour and 30 minutes to get through the discussion. Actually, it's a little bit less than that. I will therefore direct some questions to the panelists, and we'll also make time to take questions from our audience. We want to know your views and opinions on this topic, so please feel free to send us questions through the chat box, and I will direct those to our panelists. At the end, I will then hand over to a member of the foundation who will provide closing remarks. But before we launch into our dialogue, let me take a brief moment to introduce our panel. Ladies and gentlemen, they all have very impressive CVs. I have tried to shorten them for the purpose of. So up front, we have Dr. Nyaradzai Gumbudzwanda. I hope I am not butchering your surname. Please feel free to correct me if I am saying it incorrectly. She is the founder and chief executive of Rosaria Memorial Trust, an organization she founded in memory of her late mother. She is the African Union Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriages, a position she has occupied since 2014. She's a trained human rights lawyer with extensive experience of working with girls and young women. For almost 30 years, she has worked on issues of women and children's human rights especially violence against women, health, as well as HIV and AIDS. She served as General Secretary of the World Young Women's Christian Association for almost 10 years, where she was responsible for 120 countries. She has extensive work experience with the United Nations, where she was for a decade with UNICEF and UNIFEM, which is now known as UN Women. Among other positions, she is the chair of the COVID-19 Frontline Responders Group for the Women's Coalition in Zimbabwe. Next up, we have Ms. Lynn Chinene. She is a project management professional who has a keen interest in development interventions and the overall impact that these have in reducing poverty. For the past 12 years, her career path has been set on advocating for the rights of the marginalized. She has managed regional projects in the areas of gender equality, women's and children's rights, including those dealing with sexual health and reproductive rights. She's currently working for Plan International, where she manages a regional project aimed at strengthening civil society efforts to end child marriage and harmful practices in Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. We also have on the panel Dr. Mispa Roo. She is the head of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Unit and Deputy Director of the South African Institute for Advanced Constitutional, Public, Human Rights and International Law, a center which is based at the University of Johannesburg. She is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Public Law, teaching public international law and human rights, as well as international criminal and humanitarian law. Her research interests include international criminal law, international human rights law, sexual and gender-based violence, and South Africa's obligations in terms of these focus areas. Last but not least, we also have Ms. Siziwe Jongizulu, who works for the United Nations Population Fund as a program analyst, monitoring and evaluation specialist. She is responsible for the implementation of a project titled Empowering Women and Girls to Realize Their Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights in South Africa. Ms. Jongizulu has also worked for a USAID-funded project called The Bridge, which focused on the socioeconomic development needs of orphaned and vulnerable youth. She has extensive experience in child protection, adolescent and youth, HIV, and gender programming. Now that we have the introductions out of the way, I would like us to kick off the program formally. I'm going to start by asking the same question to all the panelists. So the question I would like to ask is to the panelists, how, from your professional point of view and experience, would you define child and forced marriages? Perhaps, if I may, can I ask Dr. Nyaradzai to kick us off with an answer to this question? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You said from a professional and expert, but for some of us, the personal is political and the personal drives the professional. My mother never chose my father. My mother was picked from school to marry my father. And so I don't know whether I'm a product of biology or a product of love. So that's where my definition starts, that what we are calling the word child and marriage cannot be allowed to coexist. Because essentially what we are calling a marriage, a child marriage is rape, is a violation of multiple rights of children, of girls. It's abduction, like my mother was abducted at school. It could be betrothal. So we have the legal definitions that have been provided in the various statutes, including by the African Union Charter, the general comments. But essentially, I continue to challenge that what we call child marriage is sexual exploitation and abuse of girls, and therefore we need to look at it within that context, even where we have controversies around issues of sexual consent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing what is probably a bittersweet and no doubt very, very personal, deeply personal experience. May I then ask perhaps Ms. Chinene if she can follow up with her explanation on how we define this very problematic area in our societies.
Thank you so much. Forgive me, my video has issues, my camera has issues. It's usually on and off, but to respond to your question, I'll just amplify what Dr. Nyaradzai has said and give a more theoretical definition on what child marriage is based off of what it has been defined in various legal instruments. Child marriage is usually defined as a formal marriage or an informal union in which one or both parties is below the age of 18. And when we talk about child marriage, we're referring to statutory and customary unions in which one party is a child or both of the parties are children. So, just to add to what Dr. Nyaradzai said, child marriage is a violation of human rights, and it violates the rights of children, especially girls, to access to others' rights, such as health, education, non-discrimination. In a nutshell, that's what I would define child marriage as.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come back to you and come up and ask a follow-up question. But I would like to proceed to Dr. Roo and ask her to give us her understanding of this issue.
Thank you, Nyachi. I fully agree with my fellow panelists. Exactly, child and marriage should never coexist. Unfortunately, they do, and also it's a violation of human rights. I come from a criminal law background. My focus is specifically on international crimes. So, but even on a domestic level, it's not only a human rights abuse, it is also a crime. So it can vary from a domestic crime. States can determine their own age of consent to marriage or their marriageable age. Internationally, the custom is that it is 18 years and above. Younger than that, it can't be done. It's, parents have to consent to it, etc. So in a lot of states, it is prosecutable as a crime. At an international level, if it reaches a certain threshold, it can amount to one of the core international crimes. But if we take a step back within a South African context, absolutely a human rights violation of a number of rights guaranteed in our Constitution, and then also a crime within the South African domestic context. And there's a movement within our sub-region of the SADC, as well as in the African Union, the more broader region, to also get it recognized as not only a human rights abuse, but also as a crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roo, for those insightful remarks. I'm now going to move on to Ms. Jongizulu for her perspective on the matter as well. Over to you, Ms. Jongizulu.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon, colleagues. For me, I'm from UNFPA, which is a reproductive health agency. So we're looking at the right that is taken away to decide who do you want to marry and when you want to marry. This undermines all the progress that is being made. And to me, it is a symbol of gender inequality. I think I'm in agreement with all my fellow panelists that we're saying it is a violation of human rights, and it takes away the girl's decision. And you find that in some of the contexts, a girl child is taken as a burden that can be taken away. And that is a symbol to me of gender inequality. That's how I can describe child marriages. And you find that this happens mostly with those populations that are left behind. You either are vulnerable in the sense that you don't have parents, you are orphaned, or you are living in far areas that are rural and underserved. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing those insights with us. May I ask, and probably direct this question to Ms. Chinene, how prevalent is this problem? How big of an issue is it? When you answer, you can give us a global perspective, or if you feel comfortable, you can also explain, the extent of the problem on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, child marriage is a huge global issue. Currently, I think this is based off of UNICEF stats. There's an estimated 12 million girls that get married each year before they turn 18. And that actually brings it down to an estimated 650 million women alive today were married as children. So with that in itself, that is a very, very alarming problem that we have on our hands globally. And, child marriage is widespread, but not evenly practiced across the SADC region. So I have my area of work makes me look at this issue in 5 countries, which is Zambia, Tanzania, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique. And when you look at the statistics, Zambia has a 31% prevalence rate, Zimbabwe 32, Mozambique 48, Malawi 42, Tanzania 31%. That in itself is alarming numbers. And obviously this is mostly driven by so many factors, but most synonymously tied to cultural and traditional practices, to which this part of the world takes pretty seriously, and culture and tradition has a huge impact on the populace down here. So in regards to the extent of the problem within the globe and in the sub-region, the prevalence rates are pretty high. And it's interesting to see that there's so many stakeholders now that have come up to try and curb this problem and mitigate this problem, considering that there's so many organizations, both at regional level and at national level, who are working tirelessly to try and curb this. The good thing is that, the African Union, has an ending child marriage campaign, to which many member states have agreed or consented to ensuring that they're domesticating various interventions at country level to try and curb this problem. So in regards, let me not go too far, but in regards to, the prevalence, child marriage is widespread, and it's a main problem of concern that really needs so many other stakeholders to join hands together to curb the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. When we talk about child marriages, we tend to think predominantly about girls. Perhaps, I'm not sure, you are the experts, you will tell us. Perhaps that is because it is girls who are disproportionately affected by child marriages. But I do want to come to the question of boys. Is this something that affects them as well? And if so, to what extent, especially if we compare them with girls? I would like to direct this question to Ms. Jongizulu, but if there's any other panelist who wishes, to also come in and provide some insights please feel free to do so. But perhaps let's start by asking Ms. Jongizulu to give us some views on this.
Thanks, Program Director. In terms of child marriages, I think you will know that we have a youthful population, for example, in South Africa. And in terms of child marriages, it mostly affects girls. Those are the ones that are affected. And in terms of prevalence, we've got about 6% of under 18s that are married in South Africa, and under 1% of under 15. You will also note that these ages, mostly these are girls that are married at these ages. And you will note that these marriages are not registered. They mostly happen in areas that are far and are not registered. And it's mostly regarded as a customary kind of marriage. So it gets the data, you will only get it when you analyze data of when you were married or when you got the first child. That's the data that we have. We don't have in terms of when you actually got married, but we see the age difference and the first time you got the child. It is then difficult to get data in terms of the boys, but mostly the data that is out there is girls that are married early. Thank you.
Chair, I can jump in?
Please do so.
Thank you so much. This is quite disturbing that we also have some boys getting into what we are calling marriage. And of course, I always put it in quotation marks because for me, it's not marriage. And just to follow on what has been said, I think teenagers are having sex among themselves. And I live in a rural area, which is a farming community and also close to the mines. And when you have boys who are vulnerable and the girl gets pregnant, usually instead of discussing the issues around what to do with caring for that child, and the boy does not have, if he's an orphan, does not have a lot of social protection support around, they're forced to, pregnancy is equal to marriage for both some of the boys and also for some of the girls. So wherever there's a pregnancy, it results in the young people having to stay together. That is one aspect. The other, which is quite disturbing, I've started to do some deep work with traditional leaders in Zimbabwe and in the region. But speaking of Zimbabwe, we no longer have the traditional widow inheritance that we used to have before. But when a person dies, somebody is appointed to be a male person, is given the title to look after the family. It could even just be a young boy because the woman does not want to be inherited. But I have received some cases where the young boy who is given the responsibility or symbol or the traditional symbols, at times is pried on also by the older women who also ask for a sexual relationship. So it's said in passing, it's not said clearly, openly, but it's something that I think it's worth investigating to say, are there cases of sexual exploitation of boys? Or some of the young men would just be young men, 17 or so. They also want to enjoy a relationship with their auntie, or who is now their wife. So I think we need to look into some of those things which link culture and vulnerability for boys, but which is rarely not explored, researched, or talked about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nyaradzai. I've actually heard of a case like that where a colleague, a member of her family, impregnated a girl. I think they were about 17. And, as you are saying, they were forced, to get married because there was a child on the way and the family was not going to tolerate a child who is born out of wedlock. Now, coming to the consequences, there must be emotional, psychological, as well as physical consequences, from these child and forced marriages. I'm thinking here of a 15-year-old, 14-year-old who now has to give birth to a child. What are the consequences, especially on girls, physically? What are the consequences of having to now be, when you're 15 years old, you have to give birth to a child? What are the long-term damage that gets done to some of these young girls? Can I perhaps ask Ms. Chinene to come in on this question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Well, you see, young girls are not biologically ready to carry children, and are probably not just mentally and emotionally ready to do that. So, child marriages, predominantly many of them are associated with early pregnancy, as girls are pressured, culturally to get married, and hence they may, get married and then get pregnant. And then in that marriage, they have to prove their fertility. They need to prove that, despite the fact that they're young, to hold their marriages, they need to have these children. So, with that said, it leads to pregnancy-related complications, which are a leading cause of death, especially among girls between the ages of 15 and 19 in low countries. And so, the consequences are life-threatening, because then you see a lot of maternal neonatal child deaths from these young mothers. And also sometimes, depending on various geographical areas, in the urban setting, these young girls may be able to get the kind of support that they need during the time that they're pregnant to ensure that, some of the challenges that are tied to the possible health complications that would arise, can be mitigated. But then, most of these cases are actually predominant in rural settings where culture and tradition really pushes the agenda for the young people to get married. I mean, young girls are married for different reasons. Some they're married off because they are being used as a cleansing medium. Some are being married off because they are of age in regards to the fact that they have reached puberty, and according to culture and tradition, they're ready. But then also, believe it or not, we have a lot of young girls, because of culture and tradition and because of societal pressure, who are wanting to willingly get married, so that then they can be accepted in society. And so in the rural settings, they may not get, like I said, it's dependent on different geographical areas. They may not get the absolute care and information that they would require to ensure that they carry these children to full term and actually deliver the children and raise them the way, biologically and scientifically would be acceptable. But then, I will speak from a personal perspective in the sense that I, on a regular basis, have interact with young girls like this. And, you would be amazed that, many of these young girls in itself would actually be pushing themselves to want to get married. You see the drive. And, just recently, I visited one of the countries, and I remember meeting with a few girls. I'm not married myself. And I asked them, we were talking about, delaying of child marriage, especially to those that were actually, looking at it as a way out of poverty, for lack of a better term. And they looked at me and said, yes, you know your stuff, but for some of us, this is not motivation for us. We want to get married because society feels, you are acceptable as a woman. You're acceptable, you carry a certain level of respect in society as a young girl to have a home. So you have your own home, but the fact that you don't have a man in your home legally in itself could not be considered an incentive enough for a young girl. So it's there's so many dynamics to this problem, and as much as we from a technocrat perspective will think this is such a big thing from our end, as in, the young people, the young girls are so vulnerable. You actually have young girls themselves pushing themselves to get married because that's their way out of poverty. And also they're, in inverted commas, bringing pride to their parents because they've married off their daughter because their parents have received bride price. So there are all these dynamics, Tiati, in regards to this issue out there on the ground. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just want to take this opportunity to remind our audience that they can send us questions through the chat box, and I will then direct those questions to our panelists. But it is interesting, Ms. Chinene, that you speak about the impact of poverty and how it drives, some young girls, to get themselves into this situation of getting married when they are very young and when they should actually still be at school. I want to ask, and I want to pose this question possibly to Dr. Nyaradzai. I want to ask about the impact of COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 has exacerbated poverty. We know its impact on livelihoods, on jobs, and so on. I'd like to ask is, what I'd like to ask is whether you would say that COVID-19 is going to pose a threat in efforts aimed at ending child and forced marriages.
Definitely, and the statistics are telling. But let me join with the last conversation where girls are said to want to go into marriage. This is how patriarchy works. Because one might not even see that they are a victim. The push factors would be, the tides would be too high for the girls. So the internalization of negative social norms is what forces them into marriage. And we are seeing this with COVID-19. I've just concluded 2 researches on the impact of COVID-19 on child marriage, which I did together with a number of regional partners, including also with Plan and with WAREC, GOCC, and other organizations. We have, I know the UN has called it the twin pandemic, the shadow pandemic, referring to violence against women. For me, it's not even in the shadows. It's a twin pandemic, and we're going to live with the consequences of child marriage and teenage pregnancy for a much longer time because children are being born. Girls are not going to school. The numbers are extraordinary. In Zimbabwe, schools have just opened this week, and there are so many girls who have not been able to go back to school. Even those who fell pregnant, and even where we have a re-entry policy, the levels of stigma would be too high. So unless we also address the issues of stigma, the economics of somebody now being a mother, a wife, and having to go back to school, and the psychosocial issues that you have raised. On my mandate as AU Goodwill Ambassador, I'm traumatized. So I find even some of these sessions to be part of the thing. Girls are committing suicide. Girls are doing backstreet abortion. The levels of the impact of COVID-19 on girls, on sexual exploitation, on child marriage, on teenage pregnancy, demands that we engage not only in terms of having the COVID-19 national policies and resources, not just have a health level intervention, but also look at these social impacts in a very clear and targeted way. and the levels of incest. I run a shelter, and the highest number of cases that I have at our Dendere, at our shelter, are cases of incest. And incest is so much also related to child marriage, because at times when a girl gets pregnant by a relative, they are immediately asked to elope to their boyfriend who is known in the village, even if that boy or that man might not be the father of that pregnancy, and violence would be happening in the family. So it's a crisis that we have, that lockdown measures are locking our girls in spaces where they would have lack of services, which is my last point, that access, the referral pathway has been fractured. The referral pathway, the social services are under-resourced. The victim-friendly police or the police station is inaccessible, also where you have lockdown and there's no public transport. And the local clinics are focusing more, and they at times do not have PPE, they don't have protection. So some of these issues around sexual reproductive health, information and services are not prioritized. So I'll be willing to share the research, I'll be able to share the research findings with you. And it's an issue that has also been raised at the continental level within our African Union campaign to end child marriage. I'm very pleased to see that the final draft of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which closes today, has taken the issue of COVID-19, gender-based violence, and child marriage very strongly. And I can also share the text. We have a crisis in our hands, and it's a crisis of inequalities as well. I feel, yes, there have been hotlines, there have been technology-based responses, but we don't have access to technology in many of our communities. Even that phone is just a little phone for SMS messages, but women also might not have money for airtime, for bundles, which have become so expensive. So it's the inequalities are increasing, and the impact that it has on child marriage and on violence against women is much more. And this is why we need to respond and support community-based interventions, and also rethink the role of traditional institutions, because they don't close shop, but they should now be protectors of human rights other than perpetrators of abuse. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sorry, moderator, just to add, I absolutely agree with Dr. Nyaradzai. You know, with this pandemic now, one thing we should also not overlook, and allow me to just overemphasize what she said, is that this issue of gender-based violence, you know, sexual exploitation has now come close to home. It's happening in our homes. Incest has gone up, and there's actually research to prove that. Many young girls now are being violated by uncles and aunties. And now that COVID has come into the picture and has actually opened up a totally different dynamic to how we look at these things, it's also very important to look at how this problem can also be mitigated at household level, because as Dr. Nyaradzai has actually mentioned, this is a crisis. What are we doing at household level, and not just looking at it from a community perspective? That's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Well, if I can add also, there's also results of the CATI survey that was conducted to look at impact of COVID-19, which I can share. It's a regional study, but it has a South Africa-based data as well, which means we have a specific findings for South Africa, which I can share. It looks at COVID-19 impact, and it looks at gender-based violence as well. I think that would be useful.
Thank you, panelists. Nande, I'm sure we'll get in touch with you for us to get hold of the research materials that you have. Now, based on what we've heard so far and all the disturbing facts that have been shared, Dr. Roo, if I may come to you, do you think that based on what we have heard, forced and underage child marriages should then be classified as a form of gender-based violence?
Thank you very much for that, Nyachi. Definitely. I absolutely have no doubt that it is a form of gender-based violence. One of the very first convictions, or actually not one of, but the first conviction at an international criminal level for forced at the International Criminal Court. They didn't prosecute in particular forced marriages, but it was mentioned in the judgment where young girls were used as, they were conscripted as soldiers together with young boys, and the girls were then used as wives for the commanders. They didn't mention the word forced marriage explicitly, but in part of the judgment, the one judge stated that there's definitely a gender-specific aspect to this, to using young girls as wives during an armed conflict for commanders, for the use of commanders. Now, remember, commanders are older men, and these girls are often, the ages were estimated, some as young as 7, average of about 12 years old. So there's definitely a gender-specific impact of it. And also, again, as my fellow panelists have said, with the impact of pregnancy, and there's very infant deaths, etc. So there's a very discriminatory aspect to it. And also, when we say that it's a gender-based violence, and that there is a gender, when we want to describe it as a form of gender-based violence, I don't want there to be any mistake that we have to include sexual violence to that. These forced marriages are not just for the purpose of having someone to...
Excuse me, excuse me, Dr. Rowe, can I just ask, there's somebody who was speaking in the back. Can I ask everybody to mute themselves, please, except Dr. Rowe at this moment? Thank you, you may go ahead.
Okay. So these forced marriages, the purpose of them are purely to, or not purely, but it is majorly for the use of sex. So there will be forced pregnancies also as a result of that. So we're very aware, place the focus on it, that it's also sexual violence, because you can't have that forced marriage without that. Saying that, I think it should be even wider than only saying it's gender-based violence. Earlier, what you said about, what about the boys? At first, my reaction was, but boys can't be part of forced marriages, because I come from an international criminal law perspective. And then I realized that is the gap. And that's exactly what Dr. Nyaradzai had said about the gap that we haven't really looked at it. There's lack of scientific research, lack of academic research on the impact on boys. Because so far, when the very few prosecutions that we've seen for forced marriages and convictions for it, the person whose consent was taken away were girls. There has not been anything about boys, but then it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. The fact that it hasn't been prosecuted, we can't make that assumption. The fact is, I think what the assumption that we can make is that it just hasn't been spoken about. So even in 2002, the crime of forced marriages wasn't even included in the statute for the International Criminal Court. So it wasn't even envisaged as a crime. There's very few states that criminalize it as such. So even now, what we are doing to include that as gender-based violence, that's also by interpretation. It's a development that we are welcomed and very needed.
Thank you. I think this is an apt moment for me to ask you, Ms. Jongizulu, does South Africa's gender-based violence and femicide national strategic plan incorporate child, underage, and forced marriages? If not, is this an issue that could be incorporated, and how?
Thank you, Jackie. Actually, I wanted to come to the first, to add to the previous speaker, that child marriage is always packaged as one of the harmful practices together with FGM, ukukhupha ifuta, and other practices that are there, mostly affecting girls. So it's usually packaged there as a harmful practice. And it is a form of violence, especially sexual violence, as previous speaker has said, because the main aim is to take the girl for procreation. So there is going to be forced sex, which is rape, and the child is going to have to go through a process of getting pregnant and giving birth while she is biologically not ready for that. And that is where we get some of the sexual transmitted infections, including HIV, and some of the complications and morbidities and mortalities in the process of being pregnant and giving birth. I first wanted to align that. In terms of the National Strategic Plan for Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, it sort of encompasses all these practices, including child marriages, which is one of the issues that is being targeted with the NSP, with all the partners, including civil society organizations. I think this is one of the issues that is largely being discussed through the collaboration of civil society, government, businesses, development partners, all these practices packaged. And I think in terms of South Africa, we also need a lot of data, because one of the issues that we face is that we don't have data, and when we have data, it's not disaggregated, including data on child marriage. So this is one of the issue where we need really evidence that really maps to us which districts have a prevalence of child marriage. And we use that data then for advocacy purposes and dialogues and capacity building for communities, including traditional leaders who have told us now and again that they are actually against the practice of taking young girls with an aim of making them wives. So the House of Traditional Leaders has really distanced themselves, the National House, on the issue of child marriage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jackie, if I may,
okay,
if
please.
I may also just add something.
Sure.
No, thank you. I just want to add also to what was just said. From a legal perspective, the laws are in place at all levels, and one of the documents that you also forwarded us on the Southern African Development Community, the model law on eradicating child marriage. So there's definitely a movement in that direction. And I think conversations like this assist in actually gaining traction, and that it will assist in change. And I really like that traditional leaders, etc., and within communities, whether it's cultural, religious communities, must be involved in this conversation, because the movement globally is that this is something that's not acceptable. There's a couple of places, as I mentioned, also that have where it is illegal, but the problem is that it's mostly left up to states. For example, in Nigeria, the laws are so inconsistent there, it's very difficult even to see when, how old a girl or a boy must be to consent to marriage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I jump in here? Sorry, moderator. Moderator, I have a growing discomfort in the growing discourse on the continent and globally, where child marriage is so much confined to a harmful practice. The language of harmful practice then is tagged to traditional harmful practice. I feel it's narrowing the discourse. It's narrowing the analysis to making it a community issue only or mostly, and making it an issue of only traditions. I feel
Dr. Nyaradzai, we have lost you there. Okay, I think let me just take a couple of questions from the audience. We have, let me see, 1, 2, 3, we've got 4 questions. So the first question is, where and how do we begin to conscientize young men and women about the wrongness of what they have been taught to be proud of culturally, i.e., that child marriages are acceptable, that they equally bring pride to their communities and themselves, especially in the South African context? Perhaps, may I ask Ms. Jongizulu to take that question?
May you please repeat the question?
Okay, I'm going to do so. The question says, where and how do we begin to conscientize young men and women about the wrongness of what they have been taught to be proud of culturally, i.e., that child marriages are acceptable, that they equally bring pride to their communities and themselves? Did you get the question?
I think, okay. No, you were breaking a bit, but I think I heard parts of the question. I think the work that you are doing with men and boys, you know, trying to reinforce positive masculinities is one of the way of dealing with the challenge. Okay. But I also think that communities are really not proud. The majority of the communities are not proud of the child marriages. I will take an example of the communities in OR Tambo that were mostly in all the newspapers for the wrong reasons, that it was a district that had a lot of child marriages. Through the engagements with community leaders, including religious and traditional leaders, it came out that they were not proud of what was happening. So I don't think men and young boys and women, there's no one that is proud of child marriages. As the panelists have indicated earlier on, that this happens in areas, this is hidden. As a result, it's even difficult to get concrete data in terms of how many of the children have been forced into marrying. I don't even want us to cover this and saying it's a marriage, because these girls are taken, raped by older men that are older than them. So I don't think anyone is proud in the communities of this practice, but I think we just need to keep on having dialogues like this one at this level, but also at a community level, where we have communities standing together against this practice, because it is really difficult to track, because it happens there at community level. Thank you so much.
Director, may I just add to Madam Jongizulu's statement?
If you can do so very briefly, we've got about 15 more minutes to go before I would need to hand over for closure, but you can go ahead.
Okay, so I'll cut my whole explanation to 30 seconds. As the saying goes, charity begins at home. Where do we begin to conscientize young men and women about the wrongness of what they have been taught in regards to issues pertaining to child marriage? It begins with you and me in our homes. Culture and traditional leadership are custodians, but we interact with them at that level in the community. But we may not have control of the interventions at community level, but we have control of what happens in our homes to a great extent. Where do we begin? In our homes. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to go through two more questions that we have received. The second question is, can we look at solutions, please? How do we change, how do we make a paradigm shift? Very often these practices are carried out with the complicity of parents. How are we going to educate our people that these cultural practices need to be done away with? Is there anybody who feels very strongly about taking that question on the panel?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was disconnected earlier.
Okay.
I've seen some emerging and exciting practices, approaches that we can go to scale with. I really like the SADC model by setting a benchmark, and if for the whole of the SADC region, there could be domestication of the SADC model law, a conversation we've had with Nomkita a number of times. I think this would be one way in which there is expression of political will, no exceptionalism across the region, and where it has to be accompanied by resources and implementation at community level. So that it's not just about legislating, it's also about alignment of civil codes with customary law and with practice, because the benchmark has been set, and also that culture and religion should never be used to create exceptionalism for accepting a lower standard other than 18. At the community level, we have seen, and I've been working very closely with a number of traditional leaders in the region, where they're developing bylaws on ending child marriage. And that's one way we start to document the African customary law, and them setting a written standard as traditional leaders. We've seen the work with Chieftainess Kachindamoto, who is a trailblazer in Malawi, and has worked very strongly with Plan. We've seen chiefs like Chamuka, Madzimawe in Zambia, Chief Bushu, Mangwende in Zimbabwe. So if we can have more of the traditional leaders developing bylaws which offer preciseness of issues that are within their chiefdoms relating to child marriage, and the penalties and the behaviors expected and the pathways of support that is critical, and then connect with the public services. I think that is very critical, and I can share some of the bylaws, and we can explore. This morning it was very exciting to see Mozambique launching its own forum on traditional leaders on ending child marriage. So I think we are at a stage where we need to go beyond advocating for change of attitude of the traditional leaders, but supporting the traditional leaders to be on the forefront of reshaping the social norms in a way where we throw out the negative and build the positive. The third, which I think is critical, we've always in Africa had single gender spaces, whether we call it Egumen in Siswati or Nanga in Shona, Imba Yawasikana or Chinamali. We've always had these single gender spaces. And I've done a research on this and we can share. What is exciting is that they've endured colonialism, they've endured modern other civilizations. They can be modified. We can remove the negativity which happens in there and use that, because it reaches girls in and out of school, the different age cohorts, complementing the formal education system, because it touches the child within the family and their community to discuss issues which are never talked about publicly. Girls, we know when they are taught about sexual pleasure, they should not go and experiment, and should they be taught of sexual pleasure and at what age? Those are the hidden conversations around culture that I feel we need the courage to go into those sacred private spaces of single gender organizing and make them feminist. And lastly, it's access to services. We just need access to quality services for girls, whether it's health, education, food security, or jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nyaradzai. I was actually going to ask a question about best practices and case studies from the SADC region, but I think you've covered that question. So let me go back to questions from members of the audience. So I have a question here which says, do we have safe houses for children, youth who have been rescued from child marriages? As I imagine that a number of them might not be able to return home or to their communities. May I ask Ms. Jongizulu to take this question, please? I just also want to notify you, my dear panelists, that we've got just 10 minutes to go. So let me ask Ms. Jongizulu to take that.
Thank you, Program Director. I think in terms of good practices, we have the UNFPA UNICEF Global Program to accelerate action to end child marriage. I think that's one of the resources that can be used. But in terms of the safe houses, we know that this practice has been prevalent around Lusikisiki. And there was one safe house that was then supported by government, where these girls were taken to the safe house. And there has been activities that have been supported by the Department of Social Development to ensure that they are brought into the mainstream economy. They were provided with some training and skills training to ensure that there's a bit of something that they can do. Some of them already have children and they didn't want to leave their so-called husbands, and others wanted to move away. And this was facilitated by one girl that started running away and was rescued by the then executive mayor of OR Tambo. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have got one more question from a member of the audience. I think you've covered it, in the various comments that you have made as panelists, but nevertheless, for the sake of encouraging interactivity, let me ask the question. Perhaps we need to understand what is it characterized with. When it occurs, is there any physical violence, rape, etc.? May I ask Ms. Chinene to come in on this question?
Sorry, ma'am, may you kindly repeat the question? You were breaking on my end.
Oh, I'm very sorry. The question says, perhaps we need to understand what is it characterized with. When it occurs, is there any physical violence, rape, etc.? I imagine that the question is referring to child and forced marriages.
Is there any, kindly rephrase that. I'm not understanding the question properly.
Okay. They want to know if there is any physical violence that comes with forced and child marriages?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, child marriage in itself is a form of gender-based violence. And, you know, these are young girls who are subjected to sexual and physiological harm, and, you know, coercion and you know, they, you know, and there's also the fact that because they enter into these marriages, they have to wholeheartedly submit to these husbands that they have been married to. So of course there's a violence and you know, harm that comes with it, which is sexual and so on. But then beyond that, allow me to just indicate that in addition to what the other panelists mentioned, let me just take this discussion back to what else can we do? I think one of the panelists had mentioned that, you know, there was a SADC model law on ending child marriage. And the good thing is that there's now a SADC model law on gender-based violence that's currently in draft that many stakeholders are working on to try and ensure that, you know, issues of gender-based violence are curbed. That in itself, child marriage is a form of gender-based violence. And, you know, this model law is going to be progressive because then it's going to address certain loopholes in legislation that, you know, law can be misinterpreted with to allow for certain forms of child marriage. Also, you know, it will ensure that it addresses, you know, the some of the adequate access to justice provisions that exist in national legislation, and will also come up with proposals on compliance and enforcement measures to mitigate some of these challenges. I mean, some of these issues such as child marriage. So with that said, you know, in addition to the bylaws that chiefs are doing, the SADC model law on ending child marriage, there's now a SADC model law on gender-based violence that is actually being worked on. And when I get permission, I could share it with the participants listening so that they can also look and also be able to provide some form of feedback on how to strengthen this model law, so that then governments and you know, various stakeholders can ensure that they strengthen through advocacy, of course, the existing national legislative frameworks in the various countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Nyarudzai, I'd like to bring you into the discussion again. As the AU Goodwill Ambassador on ending child marriages, what can you advise South Africa to do to prioritize child marriages in its GBVF National Strategic Plan?
Thank you so much. I think the first that needs to be done is inclusion in the strategic plan is not a sentence to say, and we are concerned about issues of child marriage. It has to be a robust commitment that is accompanied with measurable actions, and that is accompanied by allocation of resources. And that also should prioritize the alignment of laws across the various sectors. Because what I found in many countries as AU Goodwill Ambassador is that usually there's a good statement of law to say the age of marriage is 18. But when we look at what the education policy is saying, what the health policy is saying, what the labor laws are saying, there may be contradictions. So the adequacy of the legislative framework should be more than just inclusion in a single policy, but ensuring that there is harmonization. Secondly, it is very important that the alignment with customary law. I always find that the issues of child marriage demands that we do more of the customary jurisprudence related to children's rights and child protection at the national level, because the civil codes are important, but they are insufficient. I mean, as a lawyer, remember we had to quote the Roman Dutch lawyers, we had to quote Lord Denning in the UK, what he said in the 1800s. But we also want to, with certainty, our communities to be able to refer to a positive customary position at customary law. And I think that is what is missing. What is missing is certainty in ways that there is common language between what is in our constitutions, our civil codes, and our customary laws. And lastly, we've known it, we've experienced it from our work on HIV and living with HIV in Southern Africa, and equally in South Africa. The girls must have a voice. They should stop being, for too long, girls who are at risk, girls and boys who experience child marriage. They've been too much of a poster. They've been too much of just a statistic. They have been a footnote and a case study. But we have not had a clear, solid, consistent voice. When a girl has a child, she has responsibility, including to speak for her child. So society is ascribing them responsibility of motherhood, but not ascribing them the right to have a voice. So South Africa should support and really organize in ways that give voice, recognition, and support to the experiences of the girls. No child's voice is a small voice. Every voice matters, and that voice can be one of healing. And lastly, it's research. We continue to need to know more. We continue to realize, is in my mandate on the continent, we continue to realize that there are areas we have not discussed, we have not explored, including today. So the issues of child maintenance, the reason why teenage pregnancy is equal to child marriage is people are throwing responsibility for the care of the unborn child or for the care of that child born to that relationship. So instead of negotiating child maintenance, they opt out through the marriage. And yet what they are calling a marriage would quickly disintegrate, and they'll end up having to take care of the girl and her child or her children. So those issues around child maintenance, child custody, child guardianship, we have not even started to address those issues. Even on education, the re-entry, we have not fully started to address those issues. So I would recommend that these are some of the issues that we need to look at. I know that we are under pressure of time, but definitely it's also about the local civil society. I am very excited to have been part of this discussion, and when the foundation was introduced and where it is and what started and how it was started, I'm like, we need more of this community or national centered institutions self-resourcing and being resourced, and for us to sustain, because this is an issue for the long time. So from the womb of our experience is the transformation of our communities as we reclaim the dignity of Africa and the rights that is ours, and which we'll continue to demand. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We've got probably just 2 more minutes for one last question. I'd like to direct it to Dr. Roo. Dr. Roo, very, very briefly, and I'm sorry that I'm giving you very little time to answer such an important question. Would you say that there is coherence in law and policy, especially in the South African environment, to end child and forced marriages? This is picking up from the comments Dr. Nyeradzai made.
I think the laws in South Africa it's quite clear. We've got our Marriage Act, we've got legislation that provides for how old you may be when you enter into a marriage. There's our age of sexual consent, etc. So those can all link with one another. I think we have to make, I'm going to be a very typical lawyer and fall back on definitions. We have to be very strict when we speak about certain things. There's a difference between a forced marriage, a marriage between children, when there was, for example, a 12-year-old that impregnated another 12-year-old. That is quite different to a forced marriage between a young girl, for example, and an adult male. That is very, very different. But I do think, yes, it's something that we can't just look in isolation and say we have the legislation so we can sit back. It has to be a holistic approach. So there has to be education from community level, from our houses, as has been pointed out by Sisiwe. So it can't just be that we look at the law only or only at traditional leaders. It's a complete holistic approach that has to be followed. I don't know if that answers your question, but I tried my best.
Thank you so much. Definitely, it was a very good attempt at what I think is a difficult question and with very little time. So we've now come to an end of a very thought-provoking discussion. Before we wind up, I would like to take this opportunity to convey a few words of appreciation. On behalf of the Foundation, I wish to express sincere gratitude to all the panelists. Your comments were very insightful. We've definitely learned a lot about this problem. This has been an inspiring conversation on a matter that is so central to our well-being and success as societies. I also wish to thank the audience for choosing to be with us. We hope that you enjoyed this discussion and that in your own ways, you will choose to challenge practices that perpetuate all forms of gender-based violence and gender inequality. I now wish to hand over to Mr. Vumile Lwana, a board member of the Foundation, to give us the closing remarks. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Lwana.
Thank you, Chachi, and thank you to the esteemed panelists who have given it all. Briefly, I wish formally to thank those that have come in to participate in this session. That has left us with few areas that I think are food for thought in terms of moving forward. Amongst those, the issue of sharing of knowledge and research information in particular becomes the important area of our work, followed by the building of regional networks, learning and sharing of best practice. By the region, I'm referring to the SADC region. The third one that becomes important is solidarity and profiling of the work in this area of child marriages. Fourthly, we can't leave this one, which is much more important, especially in the South African context. Mobilize social partners more in particular our South African Police Service, to pay special attention to child marriages within their quarterly GBV reporting protocols. I think we've got to find the expression that talks to that, so that it is not only GBV as it is understood generally, but we also have a following, rather a path to follow insofar as a targeted gender-based violence, which focuses in that target group in particular. And lastly, an area that becomes more critical as well is that we need to ensure that in areas that are under traditional leadership, good relations with such authority is facilitated so as to enable wide awareness raising. Because most of these incidents are prevalent by and large in such areas. Although you will find them in urban periphery, in those informal areas, but by and large, you will find this in rural areas. And I think if we then look at that, it would enable us to create some what I normally would call action groups in those areas, so that awareness is accompanied by some kind of action in terms of combating child marriages. Without much ado, Program Director, you've driven this program very well, and it is highly appreciated, and the members of the panel. And I must say, much as time may seem to have gone beyond the scheduled time, but the reality is there's a lot that has been coming out, and that is highly appreciated, and that has enriched the ENG Foundation, and I'm sure my fellow board members would attest to that. Thank you, and thank you, Nabu Chair, and thank you to all. All the best.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luana. We have definitely kept to time, actually. We were supposed to start at 2:00 and finish at 3:30. So it's just 1 minute after 3:30. So I think we can all be proud of ourselves, of keeping time, but equally covering a topic that is so important and so sensitive. So I wish to thank everybody and wish the foundation very well. I wish the foundation great success. I wish to say to everybody, have a lovely afternoon and a great weekend. Thank you very much.